Hey!
We're
There
here.
we go.
Welcome to the Strat Fan Forum Football Show. We had already been talking for quite a while before I realized that we had not hit the live broadcast or go live button. So just to recap and bring you guys up to speed, my name is Dennis Crowley, aka Seahawk10 on the forum. I'm joined by my co-host Tom Cook. We're going to quickly introduce ourselves, and we're going to get back to the interview with Derby Guy. So just so you know about me, I'm in a ton of leagues, and I love Strat, and that's all the intro that you're going to need because most of the guys in this room already want to get the pitchforks out because I screwed up and did not hit the broadcast button. So Tom, take it away.
Sure. Hey, guys, this is Tom Cook. I'm Tom in New York from the Strat Forum. Yeah, we were recording for about an hour, unfortunately, and we're going to reboot, so we're going to skip on the introductions too much. I've been playing Strat Football since 1978, played dice and cards until the computer game miraculously came around. I played in about 3 or 4 or 5 leagues. I post a lot on the forum, and we're here with Derby Guy, and we're going to go straight into a review of the ratings that Derby comes out with every year that are beloved by all the members of the Strat Forum. And we're going to skip any further background and get right into the Arizona Cardinals here in our second take in our first show broadcasting. Tyke, we were speaking about Arizona earlier. We talked about your choice of them as a 4-3 defense compared to a 3-4 defense. Could you go on about that and talk about the challenges that you face in choosing what type of front to make these teams play in straight manner?
Yeah, I think as we've been talking about it when our prior one, the help of this actually is that I'm going to have to go back and look at the safety linebacker guy and see if we can use him to make a 3-4 defense, because I think that perennially this is a 3-4 defense. Initially, I really didn't use the snap counts to necessarily determine the starters on this team. I was using the starters, the guys that were listed on the game books, to determine the starters. And, I think Pro Football Focus does a good job with getting the starters right. I think they pull them off the game books. But I think it's worthy probably to go back and look, because I think Buchanan ended up finishing the year up starting a lot. So I was trying to get the guys that are listed as the starters out onto the field for Arizona to determine their defense.
Yes, I recall as we were speaking earlier, one of the things Tyke was very clear about is that even if a team in the NFL plays an unconventional defense, Longshot, for example, on the forum, talked about Deion Buchanan's impact for the Cardinals defense and how he played a little like a hybrid linebacker safety and was so good against the run that allowed them to play good run defense despite playing with at least 5 defensive backs on the field. But Ty pointed out that Strat will always pigeonhole these teams into a 4-3 or a 3-4 defense. And he also pointed out that in his analysis over the years, Strat seems to go by who gets more starts, not who gets the most snaps. So I've seen a lot of commentary in the forum about X player getting this number of snaps. Will he be the starter? But Tyke says no. Whoever is listed as a starter, whoever starts the most games for the NFL team, is something that Strat tends to take seriously, and that's where that defense is going to show up as either a 3-4 or a 4-3, based upon the starts, not upon the snaps. But maybe we can see Deion Buchanan get some kind of hybrid rating. Maybe Arizona goes to a 3-4. We'll find out a little more about that when Strat comes out with their numbers in the summer. We're going to move on to the Atlanta Falcons. Go ahead, Dennis. I'm sorry.
I thought one of the most useful aspects of the show before we had to re-record it was Tyke explaining his sources, how he comes up with his ratings, what methodology he uses. At the risk of repeating yourself, could you go through that again, Tyke, just before we really dig in here and talk about how you come up with your ratings each year?
Yeah, Dennis, I think a lot of places, and Mark did his previewed Cowboys defense out there, which was fantastic. I can tell we're using a lot of similar sources. So I use a lot of places. I use everybody uses Pro Football Focus, and I actually have a positive view on it. I have some issues with it. I think it's overquoted, but at the same time, I do think it's a very valuable site. I use Advanced NFL Stats. I use Football Outsiders. Those are very accessible sites. Another site that I use is NFLpenalties.com, which is a pretty fantastic site. They break every penalty out by holding, defensive holding, offensive holding, everything. They break everything out. And you can compare the penalty numbers versus Pro Football Focus's penalty numbers. And then the last site that I use that's not a typical stats site is Posted Stats, which is where I can get the pass block numbers that you see and the penalties that you see above the offensive linemen. It has the number of games they played, which is fantastic, and then also the number of total penalties and then the number of sacks that they allow. And you can take all of these sites together to kind of combine. I use all of these along with ESPN's stats. I do like ESPN a lot. And then, of course, all the blogs and all the other information that everybody has out there to put all the ratings together.
And then I think you also mentioned you relied on Strat's history in the past, how many sixes they've given out at a certain spot, or how many Pro Bowlers get, or how many people get rated as a left tackle as opposed to a right tackle, or an outside linebacker that might get a 0 even though he goes to the Pro Bowl because he has a high pass rush rating. Talk about that a little bit.
Every year, one of the things I've been doing the preview now for about 10 years. There wasn't as much information about football online back 10 years ago. You pretty much had to do Pro Football Weekly and a few other things to kind of get your numbers and get your stats. And but over the years, I started putting everything into Excel. And Excel is just truly a fantastic program. But it allows me to put my numbers in, and I don't count all these things up by hand. I've got formulas on my sheet, and it counts all of these things up for me. So when I get down to the bottom of going through the preview, I know that there is 11 7 pass blocking left tackles and 4 7 pass blocking right tackles. I know that I have 3 guys rated as 0 pass blockers, and I count all the 6s, I count all the 5s, and I count the 7 pass blockers, and I count the 0 run blockers and the 0 pass blockers. And then I count them in each individual position, and then each year the totals that Strat has between the 5s and 6s, there's a certain number of corners. There's a certain number of outside linebackers. There's a certain number of defensive tackles, etc. And it does vary. It's not an exact science, but they're pretty close. Every year I talk consistently about the fact that there's roughly low 50s in terms of the numbers of 6s on defense. That hasn't changed. Some years there's 54, some years there's 50. But it's always in the low 50s.
Interesting. Tyke, one of the things that was a revelation to me in our first go-around earlier tonight was that you said you really don't pay attention to the total number of defensive points that a team is going to have. I was always under the impression that these teams lived within certain historical ranges for the total number of defensive points that they had. But you have said that you found that that's not really the case for most teams, that unless someone is a super defense or a dreadful defense, the two extremes, that it doesn't really matter that much because of the flexibility Strat has in adjusting the stock team defensive card. So is that correct? In your view, the total points doesn't really matter that much?
Well, I guess when I say total points, I'm speaking individually. At the end of the day, when you total all 32 teams up, I can't remember what it is on my spreadsheet right now, but let's call it there's 850 total points of all, there's 11 defenders, 32 teams, so whatever that is, 300 and something players. Those players will total up to a certain number of total points. Now, for the individual teams themselves, anything over 50 is excellent, and very rarely do you see a team under 30. One of the things that we talked about on the first one was even the worst team, the 0-16 Lions, or say New Orleans from a couple of years ago, all of those teams still had at least 2 5s on them. So even the worst team in the league, the worst defense that you've ever seen, always has at least a couple of players that get good ratings.
Excellent. I guess we
Okay.
can jump back into the ratings now. Tom, is that good with you?
Yeah, sure, that's fine with me. Thanks for that information, Tyke. Moving on to the Atlanta Falcons, number 2 team alphabetically. We see the rookie tackle, Jake Matthews, rated as a 0-4. We know that he struggled a lot this year, playing hurt probably. Hopefully he bounces back in the future. I had thought that Atlanta might get a 3-4 defense, but Tyke, you said that there's really no way that they should be built for a 3-4, but they're clearly a 4-3, correct?
Yeah, this was off of the fact that I didn't see any hybrid players like we had on Arizona, and this is actually one instance where I did use the snap counts. The 2 linebackers, the 2 main guys there at left, you got Bartu and Morello. They had 800-900 snaps, and then the other guy over there only had a couple hundred, and really didn't even get any starts. So, without having extra linebackers to create a 3-4 defense, they have to be a 4-3 defense.
Right.
One of the things. Go ahead, Dennis.
Well, I was going to say with Arizona, we're still not sure how Strat will bring them out, either a 3-4 like they did last year or a 4-3. So just to close the circle on that.
Yep.
Sure. So I think it's interesting, Tyke, that you just pointed out a team here in the Falcons who looked like they probably started most of their games in what we would call a 4-2-5 in Strato, but Strat's not going to rate them as a 4-2-5. They're going to rate them as a 4-3 because they tend to put the teams into either the 3-4 or 4-3 front. Maybe if some team wins the Super Bowl playing, a 4-2-5 extensively, Stroud will come up with something different for that team, but you don't see anything like that happening for just a general team in the NFL, correct?
That's correct. And, one of the things that I tried to explain to all of my cards and dice folks from when I played cards and dice is, stock teams is how they make these teams, and you have to be on the same page. You have to do the 1985 Bears the same as you do the 2004 Patriots. In order to be able to play these seasons interchangeably, you have to keep the same concepts alive. When you grade all the players, when you do the cards, everything has to be done similar so you can match up year to year.
Interesting. I know that the 85 Bears actually are one team. I was playing dice and cards when they came out that had their own special rules at the time. When that game was first released, you could play the short yardage defense with the Bears, but call pass, which was a special rule one time only that they had, which is pretty awesome. I don't know if that certainly doesn't apply to the computer version of that team, which is pretty damn good anyway. As we move on to the Baltimore Ravens, a very interesting team with a lot of different possibilities for Strat this year. I see a strong offensive line here. Eugene Monroe is a 5'5". The Pro Bowl guards, Osemele and Yanda, are 6'7". I was really interested to see that Ricky Wagner was rated as a 0-7 by you. I read a lot of good things about the second-year offensive tackle. I'm not surprised at the 7 pass block. I was surprised a little at the 0 run block. Talk about why you feel he's going to be a 0 and not a 4, and if you think that maybe he will be a 4, even better.
I do believe that, anybody, I think a lot of guys that are 0s could be 4s. What I tried to do that Mark did with his preview is I tried to use Pro Football Focus's run block ratings in combination with Football Outsiders offensive line ratings, and then in combination with their rushing yardage. And, I tried to combine as many things as I possibly could to create the run blocks and the pass blocks. It might be a little rough on Wagner to give him a 0, but I'm wondering if maybe Strat doesn't give Forsett a nice off-tackle column, to go, in combination to kind of offset some of it. As a team, Baltimore didn't rush for a lot of yards, but Forsett had a very good season.
Yeah, and I think that what I brought up last time we talked about it is that Mark. Cowboys defense gave him a 5-4. So really, in the end, it's going to come down to what Strat does with Forsett in conjunction with the offensive line. If they give Forsett a stronger card, he'll have a weaker run block rating. Whereas if they give Forsett a more middle of the road card, you might see his number get bumped up significantly.
Yep.
Tyke, more so than probably any good defense in Strat over the last oh gosh, 8 or 9 years, the Ravens have had a lot of players in the front seven who get hybrid ratings. Haloti Ngata has gotten a nose tackle / defensive end rating. Terrell Suggs has gotten a defensive end / OLB rating. And Elmas Dumerville looks like a candidate for that this year. What do you think the chances are for each of those players, Ngata, Suggs, and Dumerville, to get a hybrid rating in this year's set?
My gut instinct on Nada is that he will be a singular player at end, and I did get his position off of Pro Football Focus. The injury, he did start in a wild card game last weekend, actually, from after his suspension. Suggs has been a perennial one. I think that they may eliminate that this year because of Dumerville. I think that he, with his pass rush rating and his Pro Bowl rating, he will have a lot of value as any outside linebacker. He might only get a 1 defensive end rating, but usually since he didn't start. So if he's an any defensive end, any outside linebacker, you can put him at left end or right end depending upon how good the other team's tackle is, and you can get a lot of sacks out of him, of course, with that kind of asterisk pass rush.
Tyke, I heard you mention both earlier and just now with the Ravens who was starting in playoff games. When you have a position on a team that has multiple starters, how do you look and determine who's going to get that starter rating in Strato? If a guy is starting a playoff game but only started a few regular season games, probably near the end of the year, you think that he's going to get the start over some guy who started 10 games and then got benched? How do you see that working?
And this is we got a good team later, actually, in Carolina to talk about, where I'm going to change the safeties in a corner. But I think I brought it up, and Bob Sanders, I think, is a primo example from years back when he only played 4 games or 6 games. The key thing that everybody has to remember is that Bob played in the playoffs and had a huge impact on Indy's defense in the playoffs. Oh, yeah. If you don't rate Bob Sanders, then he can't play in the playoffs. You don't have that body and that person to play. And actually, as I say this to myself, it might be a good reason not to rate Jimmy Smith, even though he played 8 games this year. Baltimore beat Pittsburgh in the first game. They're going to go on to another game. He's not going to play in any of those games, which might lead you to believe they might not rate Jimmy Smith, even though he played 5 or 8 games this year.
But typically, that 8 games is the magic number to get as a defensive player in order to get a card.
Yep. And I did mix a lot of players this year. Some guys with 8 games got rated. I think there was a couple guys with 8 that I did not rate. There was a couple of guys, I think, Unger for Seattle didn't play very many games, but I rated him. We'll get to him, and Dennis, I'm sure, will have some comments on that too. But there was some guys across the board that it just depended on the team and the situation on whether or not. And if a guy gets benched, then I think Shaughnessy actually for Arizona was a good case. He is the starter last year, and he came back and played the last 3 or 4 games of the season as the starter, so he will be rated as the starter for Arizona.
Interesting. Yeah, Jimmy Smith is an important player to a lot of teams in the Strat Football community, a former first-round pick. Got the 5 last year, was playing good football before he got hurt for the season. So certainly a lot of owners out there are eager to see if he'll not only get rated, but get a 5. That can make a big difference for a lot of teams out there. As we go on to the Buffalo Bills, I found them, along with the Broncos, to be some of the more interesting cases because these are teams that have a lot of superstar players, a lot of Pro Bowlers, and I was wondering how that was going to affect the rest of the team. Buffalo's got the big studs up front with Mario Williams, Marcel Darius, and Kyle Williams, and then Jerry Hughes is no slouch with his pass rush. You have him rated as a 4.10. Dennis mentioned earlier. Dennis, you want to ask about those linebackers again?
Yeah, I think that like Tom was saying, the defensive line is the gold standard in the NFL. The Bills have 3 Pro Bowl players, 3 All-Pros, and a strong pass rusher in Hughes. And the linebackers, on the other hand, you don't really hear a lot about them. With their Kiko Alonso out injured, you're stuck with guys like Preston Brown, Brandon Spikes, Nigel Bradham, Spikes has a little bit of a name, and he's gotten a 5 or 6 before, I believe, with New England, but they're not really your jump out at you type players. So I do agree with your ratings there with 2 4s and a 5. It's just a matter of which one of those linebackers winds up with the 5, I think.
And one of the things that we highlight here, I think that Buffalo is fun for a reason, because they were a decent run blocking team, and you've got all of these players on the defensive line with the 6s, and they had a very high number of sacks defensively. They had 54 sacks, and by rating these defenders back in the secondary as 4s, and I'm in between on Gilmore being a 4 or a 5, but by rating the defenders as the 4s, I think you get an aura of I want to throw at these guys, I want to throw at these guys, and you give these high pass rush defensive linemen a chance to get their sacks because you're going to call pass more often.
Yeah, and I think that Strat does that. They want you to throw downfield against Buffalo to bring their sack numbers up. With other cards, like, for example, Russell Wilson's card last year was a very weak flat pass card because they don't want you to flat pass with him. They want you to throw medium, throw long, so that you can get him with those must runs, and that Seattle will give up the sacks that they were carded for with a weaker offensive line. So the same way here, with a strong defensive line, they have to tempt you, get you to throw it down the field so that that D line will generate those sacks.
Yep.
Ty, do you feel like if Stephon Gilmore was given a 4, that all 4s in the secondary would be a little weak for a team like Buffalo? Or, I guess, they're not probably going to give up too many dump-offs with that pass rush, so you feel like maybe
I think
that'll work out okay.
Probably, because McKelvin actually played for the first 12 games of the year, and then I think Gilmore then came in and played well, but you don't have a consistency there. I think the 2 safeties are average, so I think Gilmore probably gets the 5 out of it. I don't usually total up like all of the teams that Buffalo played against, but they played against New England twice, Miami twice, and then of course the Jets. Now the Jets are a horrendous passing team.
I heard that somewhere.
It was decent, but I think Tannehill's probably going to be a flat pass guy, and then Brady, of course, is Brady. So I think it all equals out to average on the whole, and so I think you probably see 1-5 back there. Gilmore probably gets it due to McKelvin's injury.
And you said you're not affected by the fact that Gilmore was a high draft pick. That doesn't weigh into it, and you don't think Stratomac does that either as far as rating them when they're high draft picks?
No, I honestly think that we were talking about James doing the ratings earlier, and I believe that they are trying to grade the players based upon the season that they have. And I've always liked the Pro Bowl. I think that the Pro Bowl is a combination of the coaches and the players, and at some level we have to respect those guys, even if they sometimes vote guys in that shouldn't be there. But usually you're only talking a couple of guys a year. So I think Strat does a great job. I don't think that the position of a player matters. I do think they look at guys from year to year, but I don't think their position matters.
Interesting. Tyke, as we move on to I'm sorry, go ahead, Dennis.
Oh, just to say, shall we move on to Carolina?
Absolutely. Carolina traveling to Seattle this week to play them in the playoffs. I'm not sure. Is anyone around here a Seahawks fan? I'm not sure if that's the case or not. Anyway, Carolina, first thing I noticed was rookie offensive guard Andrew Norwell getting a 5.4. I'm old school. I read the run block first. I know a lot of guys read the pass block first, but I remember when there was no pass block pre-1982. But anyway, Andrew Norwell has the 5.4 there. Looks pretty good. He'll go fairly highly in rookie drafts next year. On the defensive side, we glossed over it on this take, but you mentioned how Darryl Smith, the inside linebacker for the Ravens, is someone that Strat seems to have pigeonholed as a 5. You rated him once as a 6 when he was on Jacksonville, but he got a 5. Everyone said he's playing great football this year, but you see him getting a 5 from Strat again. And you mentioned that you view Thomas Davis similarly, that Carolina's outside linebacker looks to you like he could be a 6. He's been getting a lot of publicity lately during Carolina's playoff run, yet you rate him as a 5. talk about Davis's rating, and if he got a 6, I was wondering how that might affect perhaps someone on the front four. Maybe Kawan Short goes down to a 4. I don't know how you'd feel about that.
Yeah, there's just guys that Strat seems to perennially rate at the same value. Michael Roos, the tackle for Tennessee, he hasn't been in the Pro Bowl for years. I think he might be an alternate, but he's just a 6 every year. And I think Thomas Davis kind of falls in. Carolina was awesome defensively last year. They were fantastic when they made, they were 12-4 last year, and he was still a 5 on that defense. So as a whole, just my gut was, hey, this team isn't any better defensively this year. They might be a little bit worse. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't get a 6, but in context, I think that he plays out to being a 5. Even if he did get a 6, I don't think it affects Quan Short's rating at all.
Right, and I think that you have to keep going back to Strat is giving these ratings for stock league play. And Carolina, no matter how well they're playing now, was a 7-8-1 team, for the season. And yes, they have had a really nice streak the last 5 weeks, and I think that a lot of the Thomas Davis talk has come out of how well their defense has played the last 5 weeks. But I definitely see him getting a 5. I don't see him sneaking that 6, at least this year.
We had one more thing, and I'm going to be changing this. Everybody will see this the next time I drop a version out there on the website. But the one corner in Kason and DeCoud, I was reading today in a blog that those two guys actually lost their jobs at the end of the year, and that they put get their names here. Trey Boston, he filled in for DeCoud, and then Benny Ben Wickery came in and played for Kason, and they played the last 5. They both started in the playoffs as well. So in my context of those guys are the starters, and those are the guys that started at the end of the year, I will probably change the preview that's out on the website, and those two guys will become the starters for that reason.
And when you don't put a rating on Melvin White, does that mean you think he's a 0?
That means I think Melvin White is a 0, and for everybody that missed it, when I go through the secondary, just to get the positions right, I use Pro Football Focus. I do find Pro Football Focus to be accurate on the positions 98% of the time. They had both those safeties right. I read that on a blog today, went and looked it up, and they had exactly the same thing. So I use Pro Football Focus to get my starters, and when I'm looking at the starters, I'm looking at the snaps to see who played the most, assuming that they started, but that's not always the case. But I start copying and pasting guys in, and then I go look and say, all right, this guy's the starter, and typically I still leave them on my grid just so that everybody can see that they're there. Strat does not give a lot of extra 4 defensive backs. If you see a 1-0 corner on a team, then the extra defensive back the extra cornerback has to be a 0 as well, because you can't have a backup rated better in general than the starter is. So for everybody that wonders why I rate some guys or why I've got blanks out there, it's really just a kind of a math thing for me. I'm just copying and pasting guys in, and every once in a while I will remember to put the 0 on him or put it. But if you see a 0 at a regular corner, then the backup guy has to be a 0 as well.
Talk about the first time around, Josh Norman. Did he rate out high in Pro Football Focus or one of your other sources? How did he wind up getting a 5?
Yeah, I think he surprised me, actually, because usually I combined 3 things when I was doing some of the guys, because I really didn't know a lot about Josh Norman when I started. But he graded out pretty well on Pro Football Focus and Advanced NFL Stats. And then, I thought he had, relatively decent. He just looked like the most consistent player back in the secondary. He's the guy that played the whole season over Kason in the safety, DeCoud. So I like the consistency for the playoff team. Felt that they needed a guy back in the secondary. He graded out well, so he got a 5. And I wasn't familiar with him before I started with him.
Good deal.
Tyke, when you talk about switching the starting free safety and the starting left corner for the Panthers because these other guys started the last few games and now have started in the playoffs, are you going to have to go back and look at the stats for these other guys, or do you think that pretty much a 4 is going to be what they both get, or you don't really know right now?
Well, this is a tough one because I believe in the team concept that Strato uses, but if they got better as a team and these guys came in, then I believe that Strat always makes exceptions to rules. So I will have to go back, and I haven't had a chance yet, but I will go back and look at each player individually. Kason definitely comes out and becomes a 0, and I think the Cow comes out and becomes a 0. That's my opinion on how they go, and then I'll look at the other 2 guys and see how they grade out, and on the assumption that they played better at the end of the year, one or both of them probably will get a 4.
Interesting. All right, as we move on to the Chicago Bears, a lot of Bears fans on the forum. I see that Kyle Long got a 6'7", second-year man who made the Pro Bowl. I don't think it was all Pro, but I think he did make the Pro Bowl. On the defensive line, I had some questions. As we all know, the Bears' defense wasn't too good this year. It was not as god-awful as last year, but it was still pretty bad. And you have them rated along the defensive line as 4.555. I see Jay Ratliff had almost a year away from football practically, yet you're giving him a 5.7. Jared Allen getting older, you're giving him a 5.6. Journeyman Willie Young had a lot of sacks with Lamar Houston injured, so I understand the 10 on the pass rush. You gave him a 4. I felt like 4.555 was pretty strong for a team that a lot of people felt wasn't playing good defense. What are your feelings on those players?
This was a tougher team for me. Ratliff graded out well on all of those other sites that I talked about, which kind of surprised me. I don't know how Advanced NFL Stats does their grades. I don't know if they're incorporating pass rush into their overall grade of a player, because the 5, of course, refers in Strat to their ability to stop the run. So, but as a whole, I thought that it played, this team gave up 34 passing TDs, which I think was the worst in the NFL. They weren't too bad against the run, but I think that's because everybody was passing on them. So, their linebacker play was very poor. As a whole, I thought they did a good job, with the other guys. They played a little bit more consistently. Willie Young was a backup again to Lamar Houston, like you said. He might grade out better as a 0. I'd have to go back and look. This was a tough defensive line for me to get.
I had some questions about a couple of linebackers in the first go-around. I know G.J. Williams was a good player for several years, then missed a year, I think, after a drunk driving episode or an injury, I forget which. And I was curious whether him or Shea McClellan might actually get downgraded to a 0. But you pointed out that a true middle linebacker 0 very rare to see, correct?
That is correct. You see a lot of 0, well, not a lot, but you see a few 0 inside linebackers. But I think even last year or the year before for Philly, they had a lot of middle linebacker issues, or maybe it was the Giants, Beeson, and they had a couple of guys, and they even gave one of those guys a 4. You give that 0 middle linebacker in Strat, and not only does he have no value against the run, the only way to cover him up defensively is to move the free safety into the zone. You can't move outside linebackers in, so it's very, very rare. You only see 1 or 2 of those a year if you see a 0 middle linebacker.
Yeah, but yet the Bears had that last year. They had.
That's right, because Urlacher was
busting.
Yeah, they had 4-0-0 at the linebacker, and their defensive line was 4-4-0-0. So, and I think that sometimes you're just a little too nice, Tyke. You're giving out too many ratings.
Plus, we're not talking household names there on the line either. So, probably being a little bit too nice with the Bears.
Interesting. You made a great point there, one that I really hadn't thought of until we started getting ready for the show, and you started talking about some of the things you do. That Strat is making a game where the playing of the game has to be enjoyable, and how some of the strategy can open up certain things. I had not thought of that, but you're absolutely right. If your team has a middle linebacker 0, the only way you can help it is to bring the free safety up. Now you've got a long pass 0-man column.
Yes.
With 4-0-4 in the secondary, and that's pretty rough. So, giving the guy a 4, it's not going to suddenly make the defense earth-shattering, and that makes a lot of sense. Maybe if they had better corners or something, and played a lot of man with these great corners, you could see something like that. But I could see where on a team like this, it would make them even worse defensively than they already seem to be.
Yep.
And then that's how you're going to get your 34 touchdowns allowed, like Tom.
Yep. And again, this is an example. This is a very bad defensive team, but Strat always gives at least 2 5s out. And that might have been part of my inclination. I went back and looked at Jennings, but he just didn't grade out well. And, he has gotten 5s out of there before. Fuller, I think, started out well for Chicago. I heard he was playing well, but then I think he fell off at the end of the year. Plus, you just can't ignore the 34 passing TDs. And I mean, Stafford was not good for the Lions, and Bridgewater was solid for Minnesota, but 34 is a lot.
Absolutely.
All right, on to Cincinnati.
Indeed.
Anything there jump out at you? We talked a little bit about Geno Atkins. We probably don't need to bring him up, but we mentioned earlier that he's getting that 5 based on reputation more than play. You mentioned that Domata Pico did not have as strong as a year as in the past. So
I think the 2 guys on here that I looked at a little bit, I think Wallace Gilberry might deserve a 0. He's been a backup guy for Kansas City for years. I might be a little generous on the 4 for him. He did not, he only had 2 sacks. Pico is a guy that has been a 5 for quite a few years, but boy, he just graded out horribly everywhere. So I dropped him down the rating. They've had 4 linebackers there for quite a while. I don't know a lot about them, but they all looked very average across the board. They've had 4 linebackers now. Burt, I guess, Von Taze got a 6 last year, but he was out this year, so they were pretty easy for me to do. I might question Gilberry getting a 4. I think he might be a borderline 0.
And I think that Burfict being injured, that you're going for a certain number of points on each team at times based on how well the defense does. I think that might help the defensive line a little bit, whereas if he was in there with his 6 on an outside linebacker, you might see those 0s up front, but maybe not this year.
Yeah, one of the things we talked about in the first one was I look at the number of rushing TDs allowed, and something I'm not sure if people realize or not is that when you're inside the 10-yard line, you stick all these linebackers up on the line of scrimmage, and their ratings come up more often. So teams that, I'm not using this as an always, but teams that don't give up a lot of rushing touchdowns probably are going to have better linebackers in terms of ratings because you're not going to win those blocks on offense as much. And then likewise, teams that do give up a lot of touchdowns, you're going to make those linebackers a little bit lower, you're going to lose the blocks more often, and you're going to give up more rushing TDs inside the 10-yard line.
Tyke, I was curious in the first go-around, as you mentioned, about George Aloka, the second-year safety for the Bengals. George was an unrestricted free agent, and I believe he got a rookie 5 last year. And I feel like a lot of Strat Football general managers are always skeptical when they see this rookie UFA who gets a 5 or something like that, like Aloka did, and like I believe Von Burfict did his first year in the league. And I asked you if you felt there was any way or any trick that coaches could use to try and separate these guys who become solid long-term players, like Aloka looks like he's going to be, from guys who end up being more of a flash in the pan. And I think you said, really, you just got to do your research, look at the player. Is there anything I can look at to try and find the next George Aloka the next time some UFA gets a 5 as a rookie?
Well, there's some stuff out there, and I don't want to give all of my secrets away, but there's some stuff out there that you can read if you're, and I know a lot of people out here read a lot, but there's some stuff out here that is out on the websites where you can find these guys and read the blogs and you have to learn to read between the lines on which guys are good and which guys are bad. I like guys. I think an NFL perennial thing is guys that are always hustling. I think there's a lot of players in the league that have talent, but they don't play very hard, and they don't end up being good. But then I think the guys that play really hard on top of it are always guys that you want to have on your team.
Makes a lot of sense. All right, so as we move on to the Cleveland Browns, which Rich, I know on the forum, would be happy to hear about. First thing I noticed is left guard rookie Joel Bitonio getting a solid 5.5 rating. He's been highly touted everywhere, so that's good to see. I'm sure he'll be going high in drafts next year. The defensive line surprised me at a 4.04. I thought they would rate out better. I assumed Cleveland was a pretty solid defensive team, although I had not looked at all their stats. But you mentioned, Tyke, that they give up over 140 yards rushing a game, and you talked about other reasons for a nose tackle 0 making sense for the Browns.
He was the only 0 I gave out, and I know Ruben's been a 5 before, so I really, before I gave him the 0, I looked. This was a very tough division running. There's Le'Veon Bell, Hill for Cincinnati, and Forsett for Baltimore. So one can probably see why they gave up a lot of yards rushing, but he graded out horribly across, and I thought the linebackers were the strength of the team. Now, on the linebackers, 2 guys over at the right-hand side, Sheard and Mingo, I think maybe they might both be 4s, but at the same time, these guys both split a lot of time this year. I think both guys ended up starting 6 or 7 games each, and it wasn't like one guy started the first 8 and the other guy started the second 8. They were intermingled all year long on who was starting. So it's really hard when you have that kind of inconsistency at a position to give a good rating. I know Sheard had a nice rating last year. I think he was a 58 or 59, but with Mingo coming in and taking some of his time up, I think they probably both play out as 0s or 4s.
So what you're predicting is we're going to have a lot of unhappy Jabal Sheard owners and a lot of unhappy Barkevious Mingo owners.
Yes.
That's unfortunate for me. I have Mingo on 2 of my teams, so hopefully we can see the double 4. I can get some use out of that guy. He obviously is.
Helps, one of them could. I think Kruger had a good year, but he signed. I don't know how long he signed for. If they play that 3-4, it'll be interesting to see what they do.
Sure. In the secondary for Cleveland, I was curious about something. Obviously, they're known for having a strong secondary. I see Buster Screen got the 4 this year. I think he might have been an extra DB4 as a rookie. I don't recall. And then he was talked about as struggling at times last year. This year, you feel like he stepped up enough that a 4 is more likely than a 0?
I thought Cleveland was in a lot of games this year. I know that I just read a blog yesterday that it was a top priority to re-sign him. I know that they've got Hayden over there on the other side, and were they the ones that drafted Gilbert? And Gilbert was terrible, I think.
Yeah, they've been unhappy with Gilbert's work ethic, amongst other things.
Yeah, I think Gilbert.
I think his snap count was dreadfully low for a first-round pick.
Yeah, so I think. As a whole, I thought this team was pretty competitive in a tough division. They were still hanging around in games, and since the run defense was so awful, I just thought that it played out. He played enough snaps out there as a whole. He graded out pretty well, so he ended up snagging the 4.
It wouldn't surprise me if they get the 0, though, just because last year with a similar defense they were 6-4-0, and this year with your other projections, which I agree with, they're going to go 6-6-5, and so I could see Screen just getting a 0 based on the fact.
Yeah, I agree, and I mentioned actually, Dennis, that's a good point. I mentioned on my one of my posts out there when I posted the preview. As a whole, I have a few too many defensive points out there, and I feel like I need a couple more 5s. And I need a couple more 0s, and he would probably end up being a candidate to be one of the 0s. And then just, this is good because this is the kind of tweaking that I do as I go through it. I'm trying to look at the totals but keep it all in context. You got 32 teams, so you got a lot of guys that could be 0s. But, in an effort to try and stay with the consistencies that Strat has, you look at each team, you look at how they played, and Dennis makes a great point. Hey, this is a very similar team to last year. If you got a 0 last year, he certainly matches up to be a candidate for 1 again.
But then sometimes it goes the opposite. Like
it does.
In Dallas, Orlando Scandrick for years was a guy that would always get a 0, sometimes a 4 as an extra DB, and now he got a 5 last year, and it looks like he might get a 5 this year, according to your projections.
Yeah, and I was surprised at Scandrick's two fives last year. Scandrick and Gay surprised me because they frequently matched up on the nickel guy as starter for these teams that kind of play hybrid starters. They're out there with 5 DBs, and I actually gave Gay a 5 again this year. But they're guys that are on the field and start, but they're not always matched up on the number 1 wide receiver. They're coming out, and so it's very difficult to figure out sometimes.
I've heard on announcements that they say that he's their best defensive back. Are you ever affected by that, Tyke, when the announcers or some of the analysis say this guy is one of their better defensive backs?
I don't know. Is it Dan Deerdorf or Troy?
I don't remember who it was. It might have been Collinsworth. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I do actually. One year it was Dan Deerdorf. I can give Dan Deerdorf credit for one thing. I drafted Richard Seymour in the other league because Dan Deerdorf said, "I love this Seymour guy. He throws people around like rag dolls." And I ended up drafting Richard Seymour because I remembered that comment. He got good press and all that. But I do hear those things. We all hear those things, and actually. A guy that's actually pretty important, I didn't realize, and I watched every Lions game, the Lions benched Hedebo week 16 because of all of his missed tackles. You do hear things on these guys, and it's very interesting. And actually, another plug for Pro Football Focus, I went out and looked, and Hedebo has, 20 missed tackles, the most on the team. So sometimes you gotta give props out to these things, and it's real hard to judge. I saw Hedebo make a lot of good plays this year, and I saw him make some other ones. So I do listen to all of it. You got to put it in context to the team, of course, because there's a lot of rah-rah out of announcers. But.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Tyke. I think you have to consider who the announcer is, and hopefully over time. Maybe look and see if he's accurate with his praise or if he's too effusive. I remember Joe Theismann used to be a guy in the Sunday night broadcasts several years ago where it seemed like he loved every guy in the field. Every guy was, I love the way this guy's playing. And I think John Gruden does a lot of that as well. So if everyone's a great player, then no one's a great player. So it doesn't help me to hear John Gruden praise some outside linebacker I never heard of because he seems to love 95% of the guys on the field.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
And we talked a little bit the first time around about the offensive line. I think we all agree that you did a good job there. They look like they're rated correctly with Tyron Smith and Zach Martin coming up with the 6.7s, and Travis Frederick with the 6.4, maybe a 6.5. I'm not sure where he'll be there, but they did a good job up front. Obviously, DeMarco Murray's having a fantastic year, so it'll be interesting to see what their cards are like.
Yeah, Dallas to me was, it's a pretty, the offensive line, and I like looking at the games. Doug Free missed some games. He's been a pretty typical 4.5, 5.4 guy. Witten is easy. The rest of the guys are pretty easy. I think the only thing you're really arguing about there is maybe the pass blocks. This was a tough team because if you look at their sacks per pass down there, this is why I put that on there. This is a heavy running team. I got 2 7s out here, but that's because they made the Pro Bowl. So the other guys, this is where the team concept comes in, I think. You have to give up the sack somehow. And with Tyron Smith and Zach Martin both getting Pro Bowl bids, the other guys are going to suffer because of it.
Makes sense. As we look at the defensive side of the football for the Cowboys, there were a lot of comments on the forum. As we know, there are quite a few Cowboy fans on the forum, including, of course, the host, Dan. I see a 4-0-4-4 defensive line for them. You've got defensive tackle Nick Hayden as a 0-0. As we mentioned during our first trial run, Henry Melton had about 7 sacks or so for the Cowboys this year. He's going to have to be a defensive tackle 0-7 or something like that, it looks like. And obviously you can't have a starter 0-0 over 0.7. Does that mean, in your view, that it's pretty guaranteed
Yeah,
that Hayden's going to get a 4.0? Or
I will have to change Hayden to a 4 off of that. And I have seen some exceptions to that, but usually much lower. So Hayden probably does get a 4 as a whole. This is, I did watch Dallas this year. I've heard several people out there clamoring for Crawford to get a 5. He graded out pretty average across the board, and like I say, I got 3 or 4 places, Football Outsiders, Advanced. He didn't really grade out great. I know McLean had a good year at middle linebacker, so he was. Crawford was a tough guy because I don't know a lot about him. I heard a lot of people saying he was a 4/5. So he's an interesting guy that I'll be watching in terms of see what Strato does with him.
Yeah, I think somebody on that line is going to get a 5. I don't know who it's going to be. Tyrone Crawford seems to make some splash plays here and there, but somebody's going to get a 5. I think that they're not going to go 4-4-0, 4, or even 4-4-4. Well, actually, I could see them go all 4s. So there's going to be a bump there at some point. So if it's Hayden getting a 4, I could see them all staying a 4.
Yep.
I was interested, Tyke. I just noticed you mentioned how it seems like even the very worst defenses will have at least 2 5s. The Cowboys' defense was much improved this year, even though it wasn't great statistically. They only have 2 players that you projected to be better than a 4. That's Orlando Scandrick and Orlando McLean. Doesn't that seem a little low to you for a team that wasn't awful?
Not for a team that just robbed my Lions at the playoffs. I digress. But
sound effect time.
Oh, very good sound effect. Very nice. I think I'm with Dennis. Looking at it for a playoff team, I think we see a 5 on the defensive line. I think we're going to have to. I still don't believe they're as good as, but they're getting it done. They are getting it done, and I know it's not all the offense. They held the Lions, at that drive at the end of the game last week, and they got it done, and they've continued to make it work. So I think we probably see a 5 on the defensive line.
I see you have rookie outside linebacker Anthony Hitchens rated as a 4. Now, does he become a 6 if it's 3rd and 1 and he's covering Brandon Pettigrew in the 4th quarter of a game?
Yes, he does.
Could there be an asterisk on the card there?
I was going for a badum-too. Sorry, guys.
You could tell this is our first broadcast. I think we need to work out on the sound effects. Who is that guy?
There's what I want.
There you go. All right, now Sterling Moore is another guy on the Cowboys, another defensive back. You don't have any number for him. That means you think he's going to be a 0. I thought I read that he graded out pretty well. You don't see him as possibly an extra defensive back 4?
I think Sterling to me ends up being a player that this team still did give up 252 yards a game in the pass. Now they're very low in sacks. So Dennis made a very good point earlier that any kind of stock replay. The dump-off rule didn't exist 20 years ago, but this team was pretty horrendous in sack power. Only 28 sacks on the season, if I have that right. I tried to update those, so it would make some sense, at some levels, to try and figure out how to rate these guys. Moore could be a 4. At 250 yards is still a lot of yards.
Yep.
All right, very well. As we move on to the Denver Broncos, playing this weekend, of course, first thing I noticed was the offensive line. Denver had to do a lot of shuffling on the line this year. I think they had an injury over there on the right side, maybe Chris Clark. I don't recall who it was. Yep. I see Orlando Franklin very notoriously moved from offensive tackle to guard this year with Ryan Clady's return. He was a 5'7" at tackle last year. You've got him as a 4 in the run game this year. Talk about what makes you feel Orlando's going to get a downgrade this year.
This was an interesting team, and actually I probably am going to watch the playoff game this weekend to see who the starters are to determine whether or not I put Clark back in at tackle. I haven't seen the injury reports at all because normally, I know they all shifted. I looked at this a lot the other day, actually. I have Montgomery in at center right now, but normally Ramirez is the center, Vasquez is the guard, and Clark was the tackle. But Clark was hurt, and then they showed him as not starting, I think, week 16. So now that they've had a week off, and they play this playoff game, I think I'll probably look at who the starters are in the playoff game, and that's who I'll end up putting in as the starters. That, Ramirez could go back to center, Vasquez the guard. I do think some of these guys will be rated at two positions because they've played, half the season at both of them.
One thing I noticed on the Broncos, Tyke, and I noticed it on, I believe, the Saints as well, you gave a 4-run block to both Julius Thomas and I think Jimmy Graham. As we know, last year was the first year that Strat trotted out these tight end zeros, which I think was a great idea to represent the modern game. Did you just sort of knee-jerk give these guys a 4, maybe overlook the concept of a tight end zero? What are your thoughts there?
I think I did give one tight end 0. It's just all of my other previews were based off of 10 years of everybody always being a 4.
Okay.
They did keep their run blocks as a total consistent. I did actually go back through the only place I've ever seen that has tight end run blocking is Pro Football Focus.
Sure.
I've never seen anyone else does it, so it's a very difficult thing to quantify, if you will, as how good of a run blocker a tight end is. You can go by word of mouth and a lot of other things, of course. I honestly thought that Gronkowski should have been a 5 the last couple of years, and they refused to, but that's because the guy's always catching passes. But at the same time, I do think there may be some zeros. I agree with you. I liked the zeros last year a lot. I think it's a good thing. It helps make the game play a little bit like you want it to play. But I admit, I looked at Thomas again, and they didn't grade out as badly as they did last year.
Okay, interesting. As we go over to the defensive side of the football for the Broncos, this was a team that really interested me. I wrote a post on the forum about it. They had, I think it's, 5 Pro Bowlers. You got DeMarcus Ware, Von Miller, Chris Harris Jr., Aqib Talib, and T.J. Ward. You've got all those guys as 6s naturally. Now, that doesn't leave a lot of room for good ratings, I thought, on the rest of the defense, but you've got 3 guys rated a 5. Terrence Knighton, I think most people think is definitely going to get at least a 5. Brandon Marshall was written about as playing very well this year. You've got him as a 5. I was really interested in that free safety 5 for Raheem Moore in a secondary that already has 3 6s on a defense that has so many good ratings. His rating as a 5 and Sylvester Williams' rating as a defensive tackle 0 on a team with an excellent run.
Well,
run defense was interesting to me.
I guess it wasn't a tough team. The thing about this team is that, statistically speaking, they're pretty unbelievable. I mean, 79 yards a game rushing, only 9 rushing TDs, and I'm going to have to go back and actually look. I have them down as only allowing 9 passing TDs all year.
Jeez.
I gotta go look at that and see it. But if that's the case, I can't imagine that's true. But I got to go back and look. But if it is true, and that's pretty unbelievable to only give up that many passing TDs. Probably off here. I probably should go look it up. But maybe it was 19 and I put 9. I might have missed a 1 there or something like that. But statistically speaking, they were pretty unbelievable.
That would give them only 18 TDs allowed all year on both sides, so that's not right.
So, I looked at Knighton a lot. I saw a lot of people out there talking about Knighton, and I looked at him, and I just couldn't pull the trigger on him being a 6.
Sure.
He just didn't, it's not to say that he won't be. I didn't see the statistics or the grades or the other things that would lead me to believe that he had taken the extra step with all of the other guys being 6s out there.
Now, they only allowed, I think, about 3.7 yards per carry, the 79 rushing yards you mentioned. Sylvester Williams graded out pretty terribly everywhere I looked. So you feel like even with their stout run defensive numbers, that Sylvester will get the old 0, huh?
Well, the tough thing with these teams is that Denver's playing from ahead a lot.
Sure.
So teams aren't going to run the ball against them a lot because they're behind. With Strat running back cards getting more progressively different, in my opinion, it's hard to get guys that really make you want to call run a lot. And
sure.
This team's going to play. They did play in a tough division. Kansas City was a borderline playoff team. San Diego's a borderline playoff team. Oakland was pretty terrible. Carr actually had a pretty decent season, but I think it was a tough division. But man, when they played good teams, they ended up getting their butts kicked too. I mean, New England put
That's
a
true.
pretty good whooping on them. So I kind of struggled with how good this team should really be defensively. I mean, the stats are the stats, but that was part of the reason I gave Knighton a 5, and some of the other guys graded out the way they did. It just didn't feel like they. Williams graded out horribly, and
It's funny you mention. It's funny you mention that in the NFL, when a team falls behind a lot, they're going to pass all the time. It's almost the opposite in Strato, especially in these draft leagues. You go down, you're down 10 with 9 minutes to go. You're going to start running the ball a lot of times because guys are going to give you the run. You've got a back in there who might be decent in a draft league. So you always see these teams who are pretty good a lot of times giving up big rushing games in games that they win. That's just a different way that the game plays often than the NFL plays.
Predicated, of course, in Strat on the fact that you call run and pass at the beginning of a play. It's this extra requirement that in the real NFL, in baseball there's no run or pass. Basketball there's no run or pass. I've played in all of those, but football you have to make this decision, and it drastically can affect the results of the play.
Sure, makes it a lot more fun to play though.
Yeah, the game is the game. That's just the way it is. It's not the NFL. It's I don't even know if you should consider it a simulation of the NFL. At times, it really is just a head-to-head game, and that's what makes it so enjoyable to me, anyway.
The views expressed by Dennis Crowley do not represent the Strat Fan Football Forum. You get us in trouble here, Dennis. Come on now. We all love this game. It is the NFL, Dennis.
Oh, wrong one.
Yeah, very nice.
How else can you explain Russell Wilson doing so well? He's the man of a million intangibles, right, Dennis?
Absolutely. Got to coach him up. Let him play.
All right. Now, as we move on to the Detroit Lions, Tyke mentioned he's a Lions fan. They're sort of my adopted NFC team. I was a big Barry Sanders fan. A rough week for the Lions. We won't get into that too much, or we'll be here all night. But looking at the ratings, first thing I noticed that leapt out at me is Larry Warford getting a very strong rating, a 5.7. Larry, of course, had a great rookie year, especially for, I think, a third-round pick. Got an excellent rating last year, was drafted very highly in most leagues. This year you didn't hear a lot about him, but he gets a strong rating again. Talk about what you saw and read that made you feel that Larry is clearly the standout on the line.
That's a good question, and he didn't necessarily grade out, but I felt like that the Lions were consistently running behind him. I think that's where they were trying to run. They ran a lot of trap plays with Joyke Bell and moved him around, and I think he was consistently the best player on the line. It's tough to give a bunch of 0s and 4s out, so there's a chance, I think, that maybe he heads down to a 4, but I still think he was the most consistent guy on there, and I think he's a tough guy. I think they missed him in the playoffs, so he ended up getting the best rating on the line there.
Well, that'll certainly be a nice treat for any of the Larry Warford owners out there who want to justify their high selection of him last year. I do think he's an excellent long-term player. Now, as we look at this Detroit defense that I think really earned their reputation or solidified their reputation with that first half against the Cowboys, people feel like Detroit's for real now. I was a little surprised to see Ezekiel Ansah, who I have in one league, get a 6 from you. Ziggy did not make any Pro Bowls. How strongly do you feel like he is actually going to get that 6? He did not make the Pro Bowl, correct?
He did not, and I love this 6 for him. When I started grading this team, I was surprised, but I do think that this actually was the best run defensive team in the league. Sue should be a 7. He was just a monster all year. He was crazy. He was unblockable. That year Revis had 3 or 4 years ago as a corner. I think Sue's year defensively as a run D tackle was that good. But losing Fairley, I think, also contributed into my feelings on Ansah. I mean, they gave up 3 yards a rush. I went back and looked back 10 years at run defense. This team was on the field a lot because their offense wasn't very good. And, Jones didn't deserve it. And then with Fairley getting hurt, Mosley coming in, Levy's an easy guy, but I don't think, I didn't look up and see Tahir Whitehead in a lot of plays, and I thought Ansah did a great job holding his contain on the edge and getting the corner. So I think he fits. I think he deserves the 6.
We had a comment on the forum, I think from Fred Boberts, about Ashley Palmer's 0. Fred felt that the way Detroit's defense played this year, they really shouldn't have any linebacker zeros. Talk about why you think Palmer deserves a 0.
Palmer is tough, and this may be because the Lions played. He only played. This is a situation where I did look at snaps. He is officially the starter over there, but Outsiders and Pro Football Focus only had him playing 200 and something snaps. I mean, he only played a quarter of the time. There's usually 900, 1,000 snaps in a year. And certainly I understand what Fred is saying. In order to make this team play that well defensively, I could see the 4. But for a guy that only played a quarter of the season and was virtually invisible from a defensive standpoint, he deserves a 0, but could be a 4 because of the team concept.
Now, were his low snaps because they were going nickel a lot? Were there a lot of other linebackers taking the field, or did you not get into that level of analysis with
I think
Palmer?
They played the nickel guy. I think they played Vaughn, and the other guy they played a lot. And I know they rotated, especially when Fairley, they were especially effective in there because they had Jones and Mosley, and they had some other guys that they rotated in and out a lot. And I think they played one of the other safeties in there frequently. So he deserves a 0, but he could be a 4 because, as we discussed with Arizona and Atlanta, you got to be a 3-4 or a 4-3. So we know he's going to get rated. The question is he going to be a 0 or a 4?
Now, I was really surprised at this Detroit passing defense. 5-5-5-6. That's pretty strong.
Yeah,
I know Detroit was a top-flight team. I love the 5 for Darius Slay. He charted well. The games I saw, which were quite a few, he seemed to be the guy to match up on the other team's number 1 and play well. You mentioned Hidigbo hitting the bench. How strongly do you feel about this very strong-looking secondary set of ratings for the Lions?
Well, I really thought the Lions secondary played well over. Now they only played 4 good offensive teams all year. They played New Orleans, they played New England, and Green Bay twice. Most of the other, Buffalo is not good. The Jets weren't good. The Bears really weren't great. Who else?
Minnesota.
All right, we're still here, making sure we didn't lose Dennis there. He's not showing up, but we still say live, so I think we're okay.
Yeah, we're okay. I don't know how we're going to.
We'll wait until he gets back on here.
All right. Well, you can continue talking. I'll keep going.
So, Slay, I feel for sure is a 5. That's just my take on him. Glover gets a 6. He was a Pro Bowler. The other 2 guys, I really thought Mathis played solid on the number 2. He was physical. Everybody gives up some pass catches. I really thought Mathis played very well. The guy that I'm leaning towards actually giving the 4-2 now is Hidigbo. He made some great plays, but he had a little T-buck in him. Gambling, and I think that's where the missed tackles come in and the benching. So it's tough with him because they played New Orleans, and Jimmy Graham didn't catch a ball. Now, that was the week after he got hurt, too. So, they covered up the tight end pretty well this year, and that's who he has to cover. So I just really thought the Lions' cornerbacks played really well this year.
All right, outstanding. The defense was excellent, was a strength of the team, so that's going to be interesting to look at and should be good to play with if you're doing a stock team replay. Now we move on, staying in the NFC North to the Green Bay Packers. I look at that Packer offensive line. First thing I see, Corey Linsley, the rookie center, getting a very solid 5.5. He is very highly regarded. A lot was written about him, so good to see that. Looks like there's quite a few good rookie offensive linemen that are going to be in the draft next year, particularly on the interior. As I look at that Green Bay defense, first thing I noticed, Mike Daniels, defensive end, getting a 5.6. I think he's usually been a 0. I saw that he graded out pretty well. Is this an example of a player just improving over time, or what with Mr. Daniels?
Well, I think with this team, I struggled. I was looking to give the best defensive lineman a grade there, and the other 2 guys barely played at all, or they mixed a lot of snaps. I think he was the most consistent player across the board. Their middles really aren't all that spectacular. I know Hawk has been a 5 before, and he's a guy that I just seem to miss every year. I give him a 4, he gets a 5. I give him a 5, he gets a 4. Hawk is a guy I've struggled with. I feel that Peppers is a 5. I don't think he's better than that. If they give him a 6, I don't think it's deserved. Matthews, we know, is a 6. I think Guion and Boyd were not very good players, and I thought that they needed another player up there, and he graded out pretty well. So, he gets the surprise 5 on the defensive line.
Now, regarding Clay Matthews, we all know that very famously he slid inside for a couple of games this year. Do you see Strat giving Clay a hybrid inside linebacker, outside linebacker rating? Does he maybe get an ILB 5? Does Nick Perry or someone like that maybe get an OLB 4? How do you see Strat handling that unusual situation with Clay Matthews?
I would have to go back and look. I do have Nick Perry over here at the side. All of Matthews' starts show that he was either at left or right. He did not technically start any game at middle, at least according to Pro Football Focus. He had a handful, like 5 or 6 early games at left, and then all of the rest of them he started at right. So I stuck with, I was surprised because I know some people had talked about him playing middle. I would be surprised to see the middle linebacker rating just since he didn't start there, but, if Strat has connections and they know that, he played a lot of percentage of snaps, I could see them giving him a 5 inside linebacker rating.
Well, that'll be certainly something to watch, and I think even if he gets the rating and even if he drops down to a 5, people will be intrigued by that pass rush possibly sliding inside where he doesn't have to cover anybody. Now, we think we lost Dennis for a few minutes, but now I see his picture there. Dennis, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm actually going to have to take off. I'm going to let this keep going. You guys power on as much as you want to get through. The other option is cutting it off here and doing a part 2, but I have to get going.
I would like to cut off and do a part 2.
Let's do that then.
All right, very well, guys. To all our listeners and watchers, we're going to stop right now. Very soon, maybe in a couple of days, we'll try and resume this, picking up with the Houston Texans. This is our first show. We did have some technical difficulties where we were an hour into it before realizing that we were not broadcasting or recording, just talking amongst ourselves, and we had to do a reboot. So thank you for being with us. And we'll be back hopefully in a couple of days. Picking up
Dennis away from the controls.
And also hopefully doing a spring draft preview within the next few days as well. All right, Dennis, why don't you say your goodbyes and do the broadcast thing or whatever?
Yeah, and I think we have a bunch of other people here that you guys, from the shows going forward, feel free to chime in. You have questions, you want to say something. This is not really a Tom and my show, and it's just about whenever we can get a chance, get together, talk Strat. Whoever wants to chime in, we want to encourage participation. I hope that you guys had a good time, and I apologize again for not hitting that go button, but that will not happen again. Once, burn me once, shame on me. You can't get fooled again, right, George W? So,
that's right.
All right, good night, everybody.
All right, thanks a lot, guys. Take care.